Hello everyone and welcome to this video where we are talking about generators. Now this comes after my locomotive video where I'm making a diesel electric locomotive, and I had a bit of a burnout because things were just not happening. They were not going my way, I was not getting good results. So let this be a video with sort of two conclusions. It is, if you are experiencing a burnout, take the time to rest. I spent all day outside, I spent doing things other than this, and I came back at it with a clear, fresh head. And the second lesson is, even if things are looking dire, there's always tests that can be done to help you out. So I know in the last video I said stuff along the lines of like that it was kind of taking its toll on me, and that is the case at that time, but for every problem there's a solution. So what I did here is I've lined up 3 generators with 3 different configurations where we're going to test out what is the best configuration. Now, I do know that we will not be able to fit a 5x5 generator inside that part of the locomotive, so we have to stick with a 3x3. Currently, I have a 5-cylinder engine, so here I do have a setup with only 4 cylinders, trying to see if we can optimize 4 cylinders to work, as some of the comments on my videos said. People were claiming to get 2000 Stormworks watts out of these generators, so I want to see if that is possible, if we can play with the configuration to get that kind of power out of these generators and have a system that works properly for the locomotive. So let's get going. To check that I wasn't losing my mind, the first thing I did was compare my generator output with the Pro Series one by ProKiller. He has a great series of generators. I highly recommend you take a look. All of these work fantastically and they have a good output. So what I did is I compared his microcontroller that you find here along with the microcontroller that I have in my locomotive to see if all of a sudden I'm gonna get a crazy different output, and the result is no. So that's sort of a good finding. It tells me I'm on the right track, and it tells me that the microcontroller that I developed is working properly. Now, if any of you follow my modular engine generator microcontroller on the workshop, you'll notice that I actually released a new version of it today. All I did is update this area here, where you can now actually use the air-fuel ratio to establish what you want coming out of here. Now, I did throw this difference in for this trial, but if we open up the clean one here, you'll see that it's the air-fuel ratio going to this greater than or less than, whereas previously I just had a ratio of, I think, 1 to 3 or something, where you could select the ratio. Here you can set a proper air-fuel ratio, and it will actually use this counter and this calculator and change the values properly. So that's the one thing I updated for all of my, for the diesel or for the generator microcontroller. It's actually copying the system I had in the vehicle one. So if any of you follow both of them, you'll notice that now it matches what I have here. So in this microcontroller, you actually have the ability to set your air-fuel ratio the same way. So that's just one addition I did, but again, like I said, I did add a node for this trial, and gives me the ability to change the air-fuel ratio directly externally, so we can see what the best air-fuel ratio is for the engines, because there's been different results, different efficiencies, values that this thing is kind of like spitting out here, stoichiometric efficiency, all this stuff, but I want to see what that actually does in terms of power. So whether it's efficient or not may be irrelevant if we're going to be getting a higher output. Second thing that I had an issue on my locomotive is the heat cooling. So what I did is now I have twin pumps going in and going out, and I have the large radiator, 2 of them. So we'll see if that actually prevents it from overheating. Hopefully it does. In addition to the air-fuel ratio value here, we have our main throttle, we have the start, then we have the clutch. So what I didn't do is have a clutch system on my locomotive that actually is changeable. So now we can actually adjust the clutch pressure and fine-tune the maximum amount that's going to be coming out of these generators. So over here, we have the one with the 5x5, and we'll start with that one just to see kind of the max value that we can be getting out of this one. And just for comparison, Pro Killer, his generator series with a 2-cylinder 5x5 setup just like this, was getting 1800 or so Stormworks watts. Now, I'm assuming that his creations are polished and don't overheat and all that stuff, so I'll have to do a trial to see if this is efficient and, you know, reliable as well. But his setup had a 2-pump system with 2 radiators, so I'll just kind of set that as my baseline and use that. We'll start up the 5x5 generator. Now, even though the throttle here is at 1, within the microcontroller I believe it's set to 15%, but right now there is nothing going into the generator, so once I turn on that clutch, it's going to stall out because I didn't put any throttle into it. But if I put the throttle to the full, you can see we're getting 1900 Stormworks watts and an RPS of 9.72. So that is a good value. I'm happy with 1900 for sure, but this air-fuel ratio now can be adjusted. So obviously full throttle, full open clutch. If I change the air-fuel ratio somewhere in tests, I think 13 was kind of the optimal amount. You could see this is actually now into 2000. So setting it to 13, the air-fuel ratio to 13, it does actually increase the output of the generator. So I think 13 is kind of our magic number here for power. Obviously, if you're going for efficiency for other things, then you maybe don't want it to be 13, but if you want that maximum amount of power, this is what's good here. Now, one thing that is interesting, obviously our RPS are around that 10 mark, but if I turn the clutch down, we could actually increase the Stormworks watts substantially, but also increase the RPS. So that is without even changing the gear ratio. And I didn't mention the gear ratio we're using is 1:3 or 3:1, I believe. So the max amount that is possible on this gearbox, 3:1 for all of them. So just for uniformity here, and also because I was told by the users on my YouTube video that 3:1 is sort of the best ratio to get the most power. But it does make sense because now we have our clutch to fine tune. So if we just go back to this, we obviously had full clutch, we had the air-fuel ratio to 13, and this sort of gets us that 2100 mark. And then if you turn the clutch down, you can increase that, but at the expense of RPS, which could be at the expense of the temperature going through and making this system heat up. So you for sure have to be weary of that and possibly adjust the clutch value instead of the throttle potentially, because currently my microcontroller adjusts the throttle to make up for overheating, but technically I guess you could change the clutch value as well. Anyways, 2000 is sort of our establishing case when we have a air-fuel ratio of 13, 100% throttle, 100% clutch. So that's kind of what we get here. On to the next one. In this next case, we have 4-cylinder engine here. We have one single large generator, whereas in the previous one we had 2 large generators. So obviously here when we're getting those crazy high values or nice high Stormworks watts values, this won't be as high just for the fact there's the motor, or the generator. But what we're running is the same system with dual exhaust. We're running the single air, single fuel intake. I did try a setup where I put 2 air intakes and 2 fuel intakes. I didn't see any difference. It didn't really change. A quick sidebar, a quick demonstration. I'm just going to start these up. They're both attached right now to the exact same control panel here. So when we apply the clutch, you can see they're getting identical numbers, both these systems. So I'm just going to now take this one here and add a secondary air intake, and I'm going to add a secondary fuel tank. So this is now going to demonstrate the difference or lack thereof of this setup. So now with this, we'll just make sure that each of these is plugged in. So we have right there the throttle for the fuel manifold. We'll connect that to there, and on the other side we have the throttle for the air manifold. Connect that to there. So now they're the exact same engine, with this one having duplicate systems, and we'll see exactly what happens. I'm just going to turn the throttle up all the way, turn that on, and you can see even with that change we're getting the exact numbers left and right. So it doesn't matter if you have two or one fuel manifold and air intake, it does the exact same thing. Now back to our original test. In this scenario here, we have the setup that has, as we discussed, the single large generator on the rear there, and we'll go ahead and fire it up and turn the clutch to the on position, or to 1, and you can see that now we're getting Stormworks watts of around 700, and that is with the air fuel ratio set to 13. So this is, call it, the most optimized system in a sense of power. They're giving the most amount of power. Now we are getting very low RPS, so if we want to see our RPS a little higher than this, we could actually turn the clutch down, and you could see that now the RPS has gone up, and so has the Stormworks watts. So we can see at what point we actually hit 1,000, or even better. But see, 17 now is too high. We definitely want to keep it around that 12 mark, I'd say, so it doesn't overheat. So there you have it, around 12 RPS and 970 Stormworks watts there being output from the generator. So this is, let's say, optimized for a 4-cylinder configuration. People were telling me that they were able to get, someone said I think 2,000, someone said 1,200. I'm not sure how you can get that with 10 RPS is what was claimed, but if you have an example, I'd love to see it. These are not supercharged, as you can see. They're not anything different than what is given here in the game. And that brings us to the last scenario here, where instead of having one large generator, I actually put 3 generators, but to start us off I put 2, and we'll have this clutch off, and then we'll turn on the third one and see what kind of values we can get coming out of this system here. Because we didn't use the one single large generator, this one should have a little bit more flexibility, but I'm quite curious if we're going to be getting higher than the 970 that we were getting over there. Starting this one up again with the throttle, turning on this clutch to full. You can see we're getting higher Stormworks watts, but we're also getting a much higher RPS. Over there we were getting 12 RPS and 970, so here we're definitely getting a different number. We're getting 1100, but at the expense of 16 RPS, which means an increased fuel consumption and increased heating up of the engine. But that's where this third generator comes in. Now if I feather this up to a point where it starts to increase our output of the generators and decrease our RPS, but of course if I put it all the way to full, we go down to 11.3 and 832. So in this case, that one with the 12 and 970 is better than this. But you could see here, if we go to 12, there you go. You can actually end up getting almost the exact same number if you hit this properly. I mean, I'm not feathering it properly, but here we're getting 970 at 12.3. So that's pretty much identical to what we were getting here when we played with the clutch on that large generator. So this is a 3 generator system, as I mentioned, getting the same values pretty much. when you look at these, that's identical. Now, we're not comparing other metrics like the heating up and all that other stuff, but this is just a very basic look. Now, remember, we have the clutch to play with as well on the main system, so if I do turn this up all the way here, we've dropped our RPS, but then I could actually lower this a little bit. So you can see that same 12.3 is not getting 970. So you're actually better off, in that case, having an independent clutch on that third generator. If I lower this some more, we're still not at that 970 mark. And we've increased our RPS to almost 13 here. So the best configuration in that case still looks like it's this one. If we're looking at purely the RPS and purely the output of the generator. But this is not really a comparison to determine what the best system is, it's just to determine the various settings that we do have at our disposal here in Stormworks with these various systems. So remember, everything now is fully on and we're getting these values. So you could see that decreasing your clutch, increasing your RPS gets you a different value, just as changing the gear on your gearbox would get you a different RPS and a different generator output. Which leads me to my third case now with a 5-cylinder engine. So what I determined in my locomotive was that having 1100 just didn't cut it. So we need around 1200, 1300 Stormworks watts coming out of the generator to provide enough juice for the train to properly function at the maximum allowable, call it throttle, that will prevent slippage on the track. And between these two systems here, the optimal one seemed to be, well, we actually ended up with two identical cases when we had this one with the large generator or this one with 3 generators and the clutch at around 70% if I recall. So for this one, I'm just going to put the large generator. This is in essence mimicking exactly what I have in my locomotive, and I'm quite curious to see what kind of results this will yield. If you remember, in my locomotive, we're getting around 1230 Stormworks watts coming out of the generator with an RPS that's a little higher. It's around 14, I believe. Now, granted, this system here, I put a 3-to-1 gear, so it's not going to be as high off the get-go, but we'll see what we do get. So I'm going to start it up and put on the clutch, and you can see this drops now. We're getting around, alright, 1060 or so. But remember, the air-fuel ratio here is to our advantage. On the locomotive we're having 14, whereas here we have 13, so this should be getting maximum power out of this setup. But because of the gearing, we have a smaller RPS and these 1070 watts coming out of the generator. Now if I do turn the clutch down, we can actually increase this value. So here we are getting almost 1300 watts with still a smaller RPS than what is in the locomotive. So there we were having 14, now we have 12.7, and we're able to actually get almost 1300 watts, so more than the setup that we have in the locomotive. So I'm hoping that this configuration right here that you see, if I apply it into the locomotive, it will charge up the system no matter what, if we're going uphill, downhill, obviously, all that good stuff, and it'll keep the battery on the train charged and the system going properly. But you can see here we've kind of feathered the clutch, so it's not a pure open clutch scenario. That won't be enough to charge the locomotive, so we need around, looked like, well, 80's too high, maybe 83 or so seemed to be the same value with much less of an RPS. And of course what I'm also going to do is have these two radiators using this dual pump setup. Hopefully that will relieve the engine from overheating, and hopefully this all works in that locomotive. I did run the test for an extended period of time, and the engine ended up overheating and de-throttling down, and it ended up getting 80 watts instead of the number that we needed, which was closer to that 1200. So you can see when I do put this down to 83 on the clutch, we end up increasing our RPS. We get a good amount of watts, but now that's the temperature and it is increasing quite steadily. So we'll see when it overheats, and I'll see if there's any additional pumps and radiators that I could put that will prevent that from happening. Stay tuned for the next video where we're going to look at the cooling systems for these engines to see if I can actually use this 5-cylinder setup that's going to be charging my locomotive properly. Thank you for watching, stay tuned for more content, more creations, and as always, happy Stormworksing everyone.